The Ural Mountains stand like ancient, sleeping beasts. They are indifferent to human ambition. They do not care for our plans or our courage. In the winter of 1959, a group of young hikers, full of life and the naive certainty of youth, ventured into this vast, frozen wilderness. They were led by Igor Dyatlov, an experienced student ready to conquer the slopes of a Tautan. They were skilled, they were prepared. But the mountain does not measure skill, it only measures survival. The vast empty landscape waited for them, a canvas of white upon which a terrible and inexplicable story would soon be written, a story that would defy all logic and reason. Their journey began with smiles and camaraderie. Photographs from their recovered film rolls show us this. They show faces bright with the thrill of adventure, bundled against a cold they believed they could master. They were engineers, students, athletes. They were the future of a nation, striding confidently into the heart of a primordial world. But the camera's lens could not capture the creeping sense of dread that would later descend. It could not see the invisible forces gathering on the horizon. The wilderness watches with a blank, pitiless gaze, and the optimism of mankind is but a fleeting flicker against its eternal cold indifference. It is a place where the familiar rules of our world bend and break. The group was comprised of 9 souls. 10 had started, but one, Yuri Yudin, turned back due to illness. He was the lucky one. He would live a long life, haunted by the fate of his friends, a life spent searching for answers that would never come. Did he feel a premonition, or was it merely the mundane reality of a failing body that saved him? We will never know. The 9 who continued pushed onward, deeper into the domain of the mountain they called Kolatsiakl. This name, in the language of the local Mansi people, means dead mountain. A warning, perhaps, etched into the very geography of the land itself. They were supposed to send a telegram upon their return. A simple message to signal their success. The telegram never arrived. Days turned into a week, then 2. A heavy silence fell where a triumphant message should have been. The families waited. The authorities waited. The vast, snow-covered expanse of the Urals held its secret close, offering no clues, no signals, no survivors. The silence itself became a character in this drama, a malevolent presence growing heavier with each passing day. It was the silence of a tomb, the profound and unnerving quiet that follows a great and terrible violence, a stillness that speaks of an event too awful for sound to witness. The search began. It was a desperate and vast undertaking. Helicopters buzzed over the endless white, their rotors beating against an unforgiving wind. Rescue teams on skis combed the desolate terrain, their hopes dwindling with every passing hour. The landscape itself was an adversary, a monstrous entity of snow and rock that seemed to actively resist their efforts. It was a place that did not want to be disturbed, a realm that jealously guarded its secrets. The sheer scale of the wilderness is something the human mind struggles to comprehend. It is an emptiness that consumes all, a void where hope goes to die. For weeks they found nothing. Not a footprint, not a discarded piece of equipment, not a sign of the 9 hikers. It was as if the mountain had simply swallowed them whole, leaving no trace behind. The searchers pressed on, driven by a grim duty, their faces chapped by the wind, their hearts heavy with a growing certainty of tragedy. They were looking for bodies now, not survivors. The cold is a patient and merciless killer. It does not rush. It simply waits. And in the end, it always wins. The mountain remained silent, a white monolith of indifference to the frantic human activity scurrying across its surface. Then, on February 26th, a breakthrough. A searcher spotted something unnatural against the snow. It was a tent, the hiker's tent, collapsed and half-buried on the eastern slope of Kolatsiakl. But this discovery brought no relief, only a deeper, more profound mystery. It was not the scene of a simple accident. It was a scene of frantic, inexplicable panic. The location itself was baffling. They had pitched their camp on an exposed slope, a place no experienced hiker would choose. It was a decision that defied all logic, the first of many inexplicable details in a puzzle that would only grow more complex and disturbing. The discovery of the tent marked the beginning of the horror. It was the first chapter in a story that would descend into the darkest corners of human fear. The initial relief of finding a tangible clue was immediately replaced by a chilling sense of wrongness. The scene was not right. It was a tableau of chaos, a frozen moment of pure terror that had been preserved by the ice and snow. The rescuers who stood before it could not have known they were looking at the epicenter of an event that would be debated and feared for generations to come. They were standing at the edge of an abyss, and they were about to look in. The tent was the heart of the mystery. It had been sliced open from the inside, not unzipped but violently cut with a knife. This was not the action of people calmly exiting their shelter. This was the work of individuals in a state of absolute primal terror. Something had compelled them to slash their way out into the lethal sub-zero night without a moment's hesitation. What could create such a panic? What force could be so terrifying that a flimsy canvas wall felt more like a trap than a shield against the killing cold? The very fabric of the tent screamed a story of a sudden, overwhelming threat. All of the group's belongings were still inside. Their boots, their warm clothing, their supplies, their food. Everything one would need to survive in this brutal environment had been abandoned. They had fled into a temperature of minus 30 degrees Celsius, wearing little more than their sleepwear. Some were barefoot, some had only socks. This act of self-destruction is almost impossible to comprehend. It speaks of a fear that overrides the most basic instinct of self-preservation. It was a flight from something inside the tent, or perhaps something just outside. A presence so monstrous that facing certain death in the snow was the preferable option. The footprints told a story of their own. They led away from the tent down the slope towards a patch of forest nearly a mile away. There were 8 or 9 sets of prints clear in the snow. They were not running in different directions, scattered by panic. They were walking in an orderly fashion, side by side, away from their only shelter. This calm, deliberate procession away from safety and into the freezing darkness is perhaps the most chilling detail of all. It was not a mindless stampede, it was a retreat, an organized departure into oblivion, as if they were being escorted by an unseen force. The trail of footprints ended abruptly after about 500 meters covered by snow. The searchers followed the general direction of the tracks toward the tree line, and there, beneath a giant ancient cedar tree, they found the first 2 bodies, Georgy Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko. They were stripped down to their underwear. Their hands were burned and scraped raw, the branches of the great cedar above them broken up to a height of 5 meters. They had built a small fire, but it had done little to save them. They had frozen to death, 2 sentinels at the edge of the woods, their bodies a grim testament to a desperate, failed struggle against the cold and the unknown. The scene at the cedar tree was one of profound desperation. The fire they had managed to build was small, a pitiful flicker against the overwhelming power of the Arctic night. The broken branches high above them suggested a frantic attempt to climb the tree. Were they trying to get a better view of the tent on the slope, or were they trying to escape something on the ground? The evidence points to a struggle, not just against the cold, but against a fear that drove them to impossible feats of strength and endurance. Their bodies, nearly naked, lay as proof that their struggle had been in vain. Nature had claimed them. 3 more bodies were found between the cedar tree and the camp. Igor Dyatlov, the group's leader, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin. They were found at separate points along the path, as if they had been trying to return to the abandoned tent. Their poses suggested they had died of exhaustion in the deep snow, crawling back toward the shelter they had so inexplicably fled. They were better dressed than the 2 by the fire, but still woefully unprepared for the conditions. Their death seemed on the surface to be a simple case of hypothermia, a tragic but understandable end. But the details again betray a deeper strangeness. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found with signs of a struggle. Her knuckles were bruised, and there was a dark, dried substance on her face that could have been blood. Rustem Slobodin had a fractured skull, a significant injury, though one that doctors later said was not immediately fatal. He had succumbed to the cold, but not before suffering a violent blow. These were not the simple, quiet deaths of people who fall asleep in the snow. These were the final moments of individuals fighting for their lives against more than just the elements. The search continued for 2 long months. The winter snows were deep, and the remaining 4 hikers were nowhere to be found. The searchers probed the snow with long poles, hoping to strike something, anything. The mystery deepened with each passing day. 5 bodies had been found, but their deaths only raised more questions. Why the flight? Why the strange injuries? Why the separation of the group? The answers, they hoped, lay with the final 4, buried somewhere in the silent white landscape. The mountain was not yet ready to give up all of its dead. It held them in its cold embrace, guarding the core of the secret. In May, as the snows finally began to melt, the last 4 bodies were discovered. They were found in a ravine, buried under more than 4 meters of snow, not far from the cedar tree. Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibaut Brignol, and Semyon Zolotaryov. The discovery of these bodies would transform the case from a strange tragedy into a truly horrifying enigma. The nature of their injuries was unlike anything the investigators had ever seen. The cold had not been their only killer. Something else, something of immense and brutal force had met them in that ravine. The autopsies revealed the true horror. Nikolai Thibaut Brignol had suffered a massive skull fracture, a crushing injury inconsistent with a simple fall. Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov had sustained catastrophic chest injuries. Their ribs were shattered with a force that one doctor compared to the impact of a car crash. Yet, perplexingly, their bodies showed no external signs of trauma. There were no soft tissue bruises, no cuts, no outward indication of the immense violence that had been inflicted upon them internally. It was as if they had been squeezed by a giant invisible hand. The most grotesque and inexplicable detail was the state of Lyudmila Dubinina. Her tongue, eyes, and part of her lips were missing. Semyon Zolotaryov was also missing his eyes. Some have tried to explain this away as the work of scavengers or natural decomposition in the wet environment of the ravine. But the investigators at the time did not think so. The cuts were too clean, the removal too precise. It was a mutilation that seemed deliberate, adding a layer of almost supernatural horror to the scene. What kind of force could inflict such specific and terrible damage? Furthermore, traces of radiation were found on the clothing of some of the hikers. Not high, dangerous levels, but enough to be considered unusual. Where did this radiation come from? This detail, combined with the bizarre injuries and the strange circumstances of their flight, fueled speculation that went far beyond a simple hiking accident. The official verdict was death by a compelling natural force. But this explanation is so vague as to be meaningless. It is a hollow phrase that fails to capture the terror and violence of their final moments. It is an admission that they simply did not know what happened on that mountain. The most common and official explanation put forward over the years is that of an avalanche. The theory suggests that a slab avalanche, a sliding layer of snow, struck the tent in the middle of the night. This would explain the sudden panic, the need to cut their way out of the tent, and the flight down the slope. It presents a seemingly logical sequence of events, an attempt to impose order on the chaos. The mountain, in this version, is the sole antagonist, a natural force acting without malice or intent. It is a comforting thought, a way to make the horror understandable. However, the avalanche theory is riddled with inconsistencies. The slope where the tent was pitched was not steep enough for a major avalanche, with an incline of less than 30 degrees. There was no evidence of a recent snowslide found by the initial search teams. The tent itself was not completely crushed or buried, but rather collapsed, with a pole still standing. The footprints leading away from the tent were orderly, not the frantic, scattered tracks of people fleeing for their lives from a roaring wall of snow. The evidence on the ground simply does not support the image of a catastrophic avalanche. Furthermore, an avalanche cannot explain the specific and brutal injuries found on the bodies in the ravine. Ribs crushed without external bruising skulls fractured with immense force. These are not typical avalanche injuries. Victims of avalanches are usually crushed or asphyxiated, and the external signs of trauma are significant. Nor can an avalanche explain the missing tongue of Lyudmila Dubinina or the strange low-level radiation found on their clothes. The theory raises more questions than it answers, a flimsy blanket thrown over a chasm of disturbing facts. It feels like an attempt to close the case, not to solve it. The hikers themselves were experienced. Igor Dyatlov would not have chosen such a dangerous spot to camp if an avalanche risk was obvious. They were not novices, they understood the mountains. To believe in the avalanche theory is to believe that 9 skilled individuals all made a fatal error in judgment and then behaved in ways that defy logic even in panic. It requires us to ignore the most disturbing elements of the case. The internal injuries, the missing parts, the orderly retreat. The avalanche theory is a simple answer for a complex and terrifying problem. It is too neat, too clean, too dismissive of the profound horror of the scene. When conventional explanations fail, the human mind turns to darker possibilities. The Cold War was at its peak in 1959. The Ural Mountains were a center of Soviet military and industrial activity, a landscape dotted with secret facilities and testing grounds. It is not a great leap to imagine that the hikers stumbled upon something they were not meant to see. A secret weapons test, perhaps a new type of concussive or radiological bomb. This theory attempts to explain the strange injuries and the radiation, wrapping the mystery in the familiar paranoia of the era. Eyewitnesses in the region reported seeing strange orange spheres or lights in the sky on the night of the incident. Another group of hikers, camped some 50 kilometers away, spoke of these bizarre celestial phenomena. Could these have been military flares or something more sinister? The idea of a cover-up is compelling. The initial investigation was shut down abruptly, and the files were classified for decades. The official cause of death, a compelling natural force, is suspiciously vague. It feels like the language of a state trying to hide a terrible secret, a truth too dangerous to be revealed. A military explanation could account for many of the strange facts. A concussion blast from a secret weapon could cause the severe internal injuries without leaving external marks. It could explain the panicked flight from the tent and the subsequent order for the hikers to leave the area under guard, which might explain their orderly retreat into the woods. The missing tongue and eyes could be the result of a desperate interrogation or a way to silence a witness. The radiation on the clothing fits perfectly into this narrative of a military accident gone horribly wrong. The state in this theory becomes the monster. Yet like all the other theories, this one also has its holes. No debris from any weapon or missile was ever found at the site, despite extensive searches. The nature of the footprints, a calm walk rather than a forced march, does not fit with the idea of soldiers escorting prisoners. And why would the military leave the bodies to be found in such a bizarre state? Why not simply make them disappear? A cover-up would likely have been more thorough. The military theory provides a human villain, but it still feels incomplete, an attempt to fit the jagged pieces of the Dyatlov puzzle into a box of our own making. Beyond the realm of man-made weapons and natural disasters lies a more insidious possibility, one that attacks not the body but the mind. The theory of infrasound suggests that certain wind conditions passing over the specific topography of Kholat Syakhl could have created a low-frequency sound wave below the range of human hearing. This sound, while inaudible, can have profound physiological effects. It can induce feelings of intense irrational fear, nausea and panic. It is a ghost in the air, an invisible force that can drive a person to madness. This theory offers a compelling explanation for the initial defining event, the panicked flight from the tent. If the hikers were suddenly overwhelmed by an unbearable feeling of dread and physical discomfort caused by infrasound, it makes sense that they would do anything to escape it, including slashing their way out of their shelter. It would be a primal, instinctual reaction to a threat they could not see or understand. They would be fleeing from their own minds, from a terror generated by the very air they were breathing. The mountain itself would be producing the weapon. Once outside in the freezing wind, the infrasound effect may have dissipated, leaving them disoriented, terrified and woefully underdressed in the lethal cold. In the ensuing confusion and hypothermia, they became separated. Some tried to build a fire, others tried to return to the tent. The chaos that followed could be explained by the slow, creeping madness of freezing to death, combined with the psychological trauma of the initial panic. The strange injuries could then be attributed to falls in the dark, or perhaps frantic, irrational behavior, brought on by the advanced stages of hypothermia. However, infrasound alone cannot be the complete answer. It does not explain the massive, car crash-like internal injuries sustained by the 4 hikers in the ravine. A sound wave, no matter how powerful, cannot crush a man's ribs without leaving a mark. It does not explain the missing tongue and eyes, nor the radiation. The infrasound theory provides a fascinating and eerie explanation for the beginning of the tragedy, for that first moment of inexplicable terror. But it falls silent when confronted with the brutal physical violence that ended the lives of Lyudmila Dubinina and her companions. The howl of the wind is not enough to explain the crushing force. Today, more than 6 decades later, the slopes of Kholat Syakhl remain silent. The case was officially closed, then reopened, then closed again. Books have been written, documentaries filmed, and countless theories debated endlessly online. Yet we are no closer to the truth than the baffled investigators were in 1959. The Dyatlov Pass incident has transcended mere fact and entered the realm of modern folklore, a chilling campfire story that happens to be completely terrifyingly true. The absence of an answer is, in itself, the most frightening part of the tale. The mountain holds its secret. Whether the killer was an avalanche, a secret weapon, an invisible sound, or something far stranger, we will likely never know for certain. The files may be lost, the witnesses gone, the evidence degraded by time. All that remains is the story, a perfect and horrifying mystery. It is a testament to the fact that there are still places in this world that are truly wild, places where the rules of our comfortable, civilized lives do not apply. It is a reminder that the universe is not obligated to make sense to us. Nature is not our friend. The fear surrounding Dyatlov Pass is not just about what happened to the 9 hikers, it is about what it represents, the unknown. It is the fear of a force so powerful and so alien that it can inflict unimaginable violence and leave behind a puzzle that defies all human reason. It is the chilling realization that we are small and fragile beings in a vast and indifferent cosmos. The hikers were young, strong and capable, yet they were utterly annihilated by something they could not fight, understand or even see. Their fate serves as a stark warning. The pass, now named Dyatlov Pass in their memory, is a monument to this enduring mystery. It is a place where the veil between the known and the unknown feels thin. To stand on that slope is to feel the weight of that unanswered question, to feel the cold not just in your bones but in your soul. The story of the 9 hikers will continue to be told, not because we enjoy the horror, but because we are compelled to search for answers, even when none can be found. Kholat Syakhl, the dead mountain, continues to watch, its unblinking eye holding the terrible truth in an eternal frozen silence.